Close your eyes and feel the gentle pull of the sea, the whisper of the wind as it carries secrets from lands unknown. Tonight, let me take you aboard the Black Zephyr, a ship bound for icy horizons and legends veiled in frost. Together, we'll venture into a world where bravery clashes with greed, and the weight of trust is heavier than treasure. Relax, breathe deeply, and let the waves of this tale guide you to a peaceful slumber. Your journey begins now. The wind howled like a banshee over the frozen seas, rattling the Black Zephyr as it clawed through the biting storm. Snow cascaded in swirling sheets, turning the world into a frigid void where only the bravest or most foolish dared to tread. Captain Isabel Thorne, her crimson coat a stark slash against the storm's pale fury, stood at the helm, her gloved hands gripping the wheel. Her crew huddled below deck, their murmurs drowned by the relentless roar of winter. "Storm's thickening, Captain," hollered the first mate, Miles Sable, his voice nearly swallowed by the wind. "We'll lose the mast if we press on." Isabel's sharp blue eyes scanned the horizon, though there was little to see but chaos. Still, she trusted her instincts, and they tugged at her like an unseen compass. "There's shelter nearby," she called back. "An island. Keep a sharp lookout." And there it was, like a ghost rising from the mist, a jagged silhouette of rock and frost. The Black Zephyr groaned as Isabel steered it toward a natural cove, its waters frozen to glass. Once anchored, the crew disembarked, crunching through the snow with wary steps. The island loomed desolate, its skeletal trees wrapped in icy shrouds. At its heart, they found a cabin, weathered and leaning but standing firm against the season's wrath. Its windows were glazed with frost, its door creaked as if sighing under the weight of years. Isabel led the way inside, her boots echoing on the wooden floor. The air within was colder than the storm itself. The walls bore strange carvings, runes perhaps, or the scrawling of a mind touched by the frost's madness. Isabel's gaze lingered on a chest half buried beneath a mound of snow-dusted debris. She knelt, brushing away the years, and found it bound, not with chains, but with a layer of ice so thick it seemed fused to the wood. "What have you found, Captain?" Miles stepped closer, his breath misting. "A puzzle," she replied, running her fingers over the icy seal. It was carved with intricate patterns, lines and swirls that seemed to shift under her touch. "Fetch the fire starter." The crew gathered around as a small flame was coaxed to life. They held it close to the chest, and slowly the ice began to melt. As it dripped away, a low creak echoed through the cabin, and the lid sprang open. Inside lay a rolled piece of parchment, glistening as if spun from threads of frost. When Isabel unfurled it, a collective gasp rippled through the crew. The parchment shimmered, its surface veined with lines that glittered like silver under the flickering light. The lines formed a map, a labyrinthine path, etched in frost, glowing faintly in the cold. "What devilry is this?" muttered Quinn, the ship's quartermaster, his weathered face pale. "Devilry or fortune," Isabel replied, though her tone carried no certainty. At the map's center was a sigil resembling a crown encased in ice, and below it, a cryptic inscription, "Forged from winter's soul, fleeting as spring's first breath." "It's a treasure map," whispered Miles, his voice tinged with awe. "But why the frost?" Before Isabel could answer, a strange chill swept through the cabin. The flame sputtered and died, leaving only the map's faint glow to illuminate the room. The frost on the walls seemed to shift, forming words in a language no one could read. "The frost," Isabel murmured, her breath steaming. "It's alive." The map's glow began to fade, and as it dimmed, Isabel realized something chilling. The markings only appeared when the cold was most bitter. In warmth, the map would vanish, taking its secrets with it. "This is no ordinary treasure," Isabel said, rolling the map with care. "Prepare the ship. We sail north." Her words stirred the crew into motion, though unease lingered in their eyes. As they departed the cabin, a faint sound followed them, a whisper in the wind, like laughter laced with ice. Isabel glanced back once and caught a glimpse of the frost creeping over the chest once more, sealing it shut. The storm abated as they returned to the ship, but the air carried an unshakable weight, as though the island itself mourned their departure. The Black Zephyr set sail, its crew bound for the uncharted north, driven by the promise of riches and the shadow of a curse they dared not name. Above them, the moon hung cold and distant, its light glinting off the frost-kissed map, now hidden within Isabel's coat. The journey ahead would test more than their mettle. It would challenge their very souls. The Black Zephyr cut through the icy waters like a shadowed blade, its hull groaning with the weight of frost clinging to its timbers. Winter's grip tightened with every league they ventured north. The world grew silent, save for the creak of the ship and the occasional hollow wail of the wind. Snow fell in delicate shards, glittering like broken glass, a mockery of the riches they pursued. Captain Isabel Thorne stood at the prow, the frost-etched map unrolled in her gloved hands. It shimmered faintly under the moonlight, its silvery lines pulsating with an eerie rhythm, as if alive. She traced the path with her fingers, her breath forming crystalline clouds in the air. The map's destination remained elusive, its shifting frost revealing only the next step, demanding their unwavering obedience to the cold's command. Miles Sable joined her, his steps muffled by the layer of ice crusting the deck. "The men are restless, Captain," he said, his voice low. "This weather, it's unnatural. Some say we're being watched." Isabel turned her sharp gaze to him, unyielding as a winter seas. Let them say what they will. Their fears are their own to master. Miles hesitated, then added, Quinn claims he saw lights in the fog last night. Moving lights. Could be another ship. Or worse. Isabel muttered under her breath, rolling up the map and tucking it into her coat. She scanned the horizon, but it was a canvas of endless white, the fog thick as wool. Double the watch. If there's something out there, I want to know before it reaches us. The crew murmured of ghosts and curses as they worked, their hands trembling more from fear than the cold. Their unease deepened when the night fell, darker and more impenetrable than any they had known. The ship's lanterns barely pushed back the gloom, their light swallowed by the encroaching frost. It was on the third night that the first true omen appeared. Quinn, the quartermaster, had taken the midnight watch when he sounded the alarm, his voice hoarse with terror. Lights! To port! Isabel and Miles rushed to the deck, their breaths freezing as they exhaled. There, in the distance, were ghostly orbs of light dancing above the ice. They shifted and swayed, their movements almost playful. Yet something about them chilled the soul. The crew gathered, their faces pale, muttering prayers and curses. What are they? Whispered a young deckhand, clutching a charm around his neck. Isabel's eyes narrowed. Not of this world, she said, her voice steady. But neither are we turning back. The lights grew closer, and with them came a sound. A haunting melody that seemed to rise from the depths of the ice. It was beautiful, yet discordant, each note a dagger to the heart. The crew began to sway, their eyes glassy as if entranced. Cover your ears! Isabel shouted, but her voice was a whisper against the melody's pull. She grabbed Miles, shaking him from the song's grasp, and together they began to drag the mesmerized sailors below deck. The lights hovered above the ship now, their glow casting eerie shadows that danced like spectres on the sails. Isabel turned her face to the sky, shouting into the storm, We are not your prey! Leave us! At her words, the lights flickered and then faded, the melody trailing off into the abyss. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the labored breaths of the crew. The next morning, they discovered a frost-laden mark etched into the mainmast. It was the same sigil from the map, a crown encased in ice, but now accompanied by new lines. Turn back or be lost to the frost's embrace. Miles studied it with a grim expression. A warning. Or a threat, Isabel replied. Her gaze was hard, her resolve unshaken. Either way, it's too late to turn back. As the days wore on, the perils grew. Icebergs loomed like giants, their surfaces shimmering with unnatural light. The ship groaned as it carved a path through the frozen seas, the ice growing thicker, its grip more relentless. The frost crept into every corner of the ship, chilling the crew even in their sleep. One night, As Isabel studied the map in her cabin, she noticed something new. A faint line leading to a place marked Winter's Vault. The frost on the map pulsed faintly, almost eagerly, as though guiding her. She whispered to herself, "We are close." But the frost knew no mercy, and the worst was yet to come. The glacier loomed before them, an unyielding fortress of ice that seemed to reach into the heavens. Its surface shimmered in hues of blue and white, an otherworldly light radiating from deep within its frozen heart. This was Winter's Vault, the place whispered of in legends as both a trove of unimaginable riches and the graveyard of the greedy. Isabel Thorne, standing at the helm of the Black Zephyr, felt the weight of those stories pressing against her resolve like the biting wind. The frost-etched map had led them here, its lines glowing brighter as they neared the glacier's base. Now, as the crew anchored the ship in a narrow inlet, Isabel traced the final path. The map's frost shimmered with a faint urgency, as though the ice itself beckoned them forward. "Lower the skiff," she ordered, her voice sharp against the icy silence. Miles Sable and a small party of sailors joined her, their breath fogging the air as they rowed toward the glacier. Each stroke of the oars sent ripples through the eerily still water, their reflections distorted by the glacier's gleaming face. As they reached the shore, Isabel was struck by the scale of the glacier. Its surface was etched with strange patterns, swirling and looping in ways that defied logic. Runes, perhaps, though no language she recognized. When they set foot on the ice, the temperature seemed to drop further, a cold that sank into their bones. "Captain," Quinn said, his voice trembling. He pointed to a narrow crevice ahead, its edges glowing faintly, with the same ethereal light as the map. "That looks like a way in." The crew exchanged wary glances, but Isabel pressed forward. The crevice opened into a tunnel, its wall smooth and glistening as though carved by an unseen hand. The faint light guided them deeper into the glacier, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. Within the tunnel, the carvings grew more intricate, telling a story that none could decipher. Isabel ran her fingers over the frozen glyphs, feeling a strange warmth pulse beneath the ice. Her breath caught as she saw an image of a crown encased in frost, surrounded by figures kneeling in reverence or perhaps despair. "This treasure," Miles said softly, his voice reverberating in the hollow space. "It was meant to be hidden." "Or protected," Isabel replied. Her hand tightened on the hilt of her cutlass. "But protected from what?" The answer came as they stepped into a vast chamber at the glacier's heart. The air shimmered with a cold so intense it burned, and at its center stood a pedestal of ice. Upon it rested the crown, its form delicate yet commanding, forged of frost so pure it seemed to radiate light. Isabel approached, her boots crunching on the frozen ground. The crown called to her, its beauty almost hypnotic. But as she reached out, a sudden gale swept through the chamber, and the ice itself seemed to come alive. From the walls emerged a figure, its form shifting and translucent, its eyes glowing with an ancient power. It was the elemental, the guardian of winter's vault. It regarded them with a cold, unblinking stare. "Who seeks the crown of frost?" Its voice rang out deep and resonant, like the glacier itself had spoken. "I am Captain Isabel Thorne," she said, her voice steady, though her heart raced. "And I claim what your ice has hidden." The elemental's form solidified, its features sharp and humanoid, but unnervingly perfect. It tilted its head as if amused. "To claim the crown is to claim the burden of winter. Will you bear it knowing its cost?" "What cost?" Isabel asked, though she feared the answer. "The crown's power melts with the thaw," the elemental said. "Its dominion is fleeting, as is the life of any who covet it. Your kind has come before, and all have perished, consumed by their own desires." The chamber grew colder still, frost creeping up Isabel's boots. Her crew shuffled nervously behind her, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. Miles stepped forward, his hand on his sword. "Why guard it, if it only brings ruin?" he demanded, the elemental's glowing eyes fixed on him. "Because it is not ruin I guard, but the lesson of restraint." Isabel clenched her fists, her thoughts racing. The crown was within her grasp, but so were the warnings etched into the ice, the stories told by the runes. To turn back would mean abandoning everything they had endured. To take the crown could mean their doom. She reached for the frost-etched map, still pulsing faintly in her coat. Its lines now glowed in warning, urging her to choose wisely. She raised her head to meet the elemental's gaze. "Tell me," she said, her voice firm despite the cold. "What must I do to prove I am worthy?" The elemental's expression shifted, unreadable yet ancient, as if pondering her words. Then, with a voice like the crack of splitting ice, it replied, "A riddle, Captain. Answer, and the crown is yours. Fail, and your soul becomes part of the frost." The chamber fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. Isabel straightened, her breath misting before her. She was a pirate, a captain, a seeker of the impossible, and she would not falter. The elemental's presence loomed over the chamber, an immutable force of winter's will. Its frost-rimed lips moved, and the riddle it spoke echoed in the icy cavern. What is eternal, yet fades with time? It can be given freely, yet often lost to greed. It is fragile as the first snowflake, yet powerful enough to bind kingdoms. Captain Isabel Thorne's mind raced, each line of the riddle unfurling like the frost-etched map she had studied so many nights. Around her, the crew stood in uneasy silence, their breath clouding the frozen air. The elemental's glowing eyes pierced her, unyielding and patient, as if it already knew the answer. Trust, she murmured aloud, her voice barely audible. Her gaze flickered to her crew, men and women who had followed her into the unforgiving north, some out of loyalty, others out of greed. The word lingered on her tongue, heavy with truth. But before she could speak it, a sharp voice shattered the stillness. "Enough riddles! We've come too far to leave empty-handed." It was Quinn, the quartermaster. His face was twisted with frustration, and in his hands was the glint of a flintlock pistol. The tension that had simmered during their journey now boiled over as he turned the weapon toward Isabel. "This isn't about riddles or worthiness," he growled. "That crown is ours by right. By blood and frost, we've earned it." "Quinn, stand down!" Miles barked, stepping in front of the captain. His sword was drawn, though his hands trembled against the cold. The elemental's eyes narrowed, the icy chamber seeming to darken. "Greed clouds the heart," it said, its voice resonating like thunder. "This is the folly I guard against." "Greed?" Quinn laughed bitterly. "We've starved, frozen, and fought for this. You want us to walk away because of a riddle? I think not." Without another word, he fired. The crack of the pistol echoed in the chamber like the splintering of glaciers. The bullet never reached its mark. The elemental raised a hand, and a wall of ice erupted, consuming the shot. In the same instant, frost surged across the ground, splitting the crew as icy tendrils rose between them like jagged blades. Quinn stumbled back, his pistol slipping from his grasp. The elemental's glowing eyes burned brighter. "Your greed has sealed your fate," it intoned, and the frost beneath Quinn's feet cracked. With a cry, he plunged into the icy abyss, his voice swallowed by the glacier's heart. The remaining crew stood paralyzed, their breaths ragged. Isabel stepped forward, the frost curling at her boots but never climbing. She raised her voice, steady and commanding. "I will answer your riddle," she said, her gaze never leaving the elementals. "But hear me, the greed of one does not define us all." The elemental tilted its head, the storm within it quieting. "Speak then, Captain. What is eternal, yet fades with time?" "Trust," Isabel said, the word clear and unwavering. "It binds us, yet it is fragile. It is the foundation of all we hold dear, yet it can be shattered in a single moment." The elemental was silent for a long, cold breath. Then it spoke, its voice softer now, like the whisper of falling snow. "You speak the truth. Trust is the bond that makes us human, yet it is also our greatest weakness. You have answered well." The frost that had divided the crew receded, though the air remained tense. The elemental gestured toward the crown. "Take it, Captain Isabel Thorne. But know this. Its power will test you as much as the journey here has, and it will fade as trust fades with the thaw." Isabel approached the crown, her steps measured. As her fingers closed around the icy circlet, a jolt of cold shot through her. and for a moment she felt the weight of winter itself pressing upon her shoulders. The crown's frost crept along her fingers, a reminder of the price it demanded. Behind her the crew stirred, their faces pale. But even as Isabel turned back to them, the shadow of betrayal lingered. Miles met her gaze, his expression grim. "Captain," he said, his voice low. "Quinn wasn't the only one questioning your choices." Isabel's grip tightened on the crown. She knew he was right. Greed and ambition had planted seeds of discord among her crew. And now, with the treasure in hand, those seeds would bear bitter fruit. The elemental's eyes flickered, and its form began to dissolve into the ice. "The crown is yours, Captain," it said, its voice fading. "But beware. As winter fades, so too will the loyalty of those around you. This is the curse of the frost." As the elemental disappeared, the chamber began to tremble. Cracks splintered across the walls and the faint light dimmed. Isabel turned to her crew, her voice sharp. "We're leaving. Now!" The journey to the ship would not be one of triumph, but survival. And the crown, cold and radiant in her grasp, was already beginning to weigh heavier than she could have imagined. The Black Zephyr rocked violently as the crew scrambled aboard, their breath misting in the frigid air. Behind them, the glacier groaned, its icy walls collapsing in a cacophony that sent shards of frost skittering across the frozen inlet. Isabel Thorne stood at the ship's helm, the crown of frost clutched tightly in her hand, its chill seeping into her very bones. "Hoist the sails," she barked, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to move before this entire glacier comes down on us." The crew obeyed with urgency, their eyes darting between their tasks and the crumbling mass of ice behind them. The wind, sharp and merciless, whipped at their faces as they worked, and the Zephyr began to inch forward, its hull straining against the encroaching ice. As they pulled away from the glacier, the tremors subsided, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. But the tension aboard the ship did not abate. The crown, now resting on the chart table in Isabel's cabin, seemed to emanate an unnatural cold that seeped into the very timbers of the ship. Miles Sable entered the cabin, his face etched with concern. "The crew's rattled, Captain," he said. "They're whispering about curses and Quinn." Isabel didn't look up from the frost-etched map, which now lay beside the crown. Its lines had grown faint, almost invisible, as though the treasure it had promised had drained its life. "Let them whisper," she said curtly. "Their fear will pass." Miles hesitated. "And what about you? Do you believe this? Crown will bring us what we've sacrificed for?" Isabel finally raised her eyes to him. "Belief is a luxury I can't afford, Miles. We have the crown. That's all that matters now." But even as she spoke, doubt gnawed at her. The elemental's warning echoed in her mind. As winter fades, so too will the loyalty of those around you. The next days were marked by a growing unease. The frost on the crown never melted, and its chill seemed to spread. The air aboard the Zephyr grew colder, even as the edges of the frozen sea began to thaw under the lengthening daylight. The crew, once bound by camaraderie, now eyed one another with suspicion, their tempers fraying with each passing hour. One night, Isabel awoke to hushed voices outside her cabin. Rising silently, she pressed her ear to the door. "She's lost her mind," one voice said. It was Gray, the ship's carpenter. "That crown's cursed, and it's dragging us all down with her." "She's still the captain," another voice argued, though with little conviction. "We owe her that much. And what's that worth when we're sailing into ruin?" Gray shot back. "You saw what happened to Quinn. Do you want to be next?" Isabel stepped out of the cabin, her presence silencing the mutineers. Her icy gaze swept over them. "Back to your posts," she said coldly. "Now!" They scattered, but the damage was done. The seeds of betrayal had taken root. The breaking point came on the third day. The Zephyr had reached open water, the ice fields giving way to grey, churning seas. But the crown's chill remained, and the crew's unrest boiled over. Gray and a handful of others confronted Isabel on the quarterdeck, their eyes wild with desperation. "This ends now," Gray said, his hand on the hilt of his dagger. "That thing is cursed. We throw it overboard, or we're finished." Isabel's hand moved instinctively to her cutlass. "The crown stays," she said, her voice as cold as the artifact itself. "Stand down, Gray." But Gray was past reasoning. He lunged, his dagger aimed at her heart. Isabel sidestepped, drawing her blade in one fluid motion. The clash of steel rang out, and within moments, Gray lay at her feet, blood pooling on the frost-coated deck. The crew fell silent, their eyes wide with shock and fear. Isabel stood over the fallen man, her chest heaving. "Does anyone else have doubts?" she demanded, her voice echoing over the waves. No one answered. They returned to their duties, but the air was heavy with unspoken words. As the Zephyr sailed south, the ice began to melt, and with it, the crown's power. Its once radiant glow dimmed, the frost surrounding it fading into droplets of water. Isabel, watching from her cabin, felt a strange emptiness as she held the artifact. The weight it had once carried, both literal and metaphorical, was slipping away. By the time they reached warmer waters, the crown was nothing more than a fragile ring of water vapor, dissipating into the air as Isabel held it aloft. The crew watched in silence as the last traces of their prize vanished, leaving behind only the haunting memories of what they had endured. Miles approached her as she stood at the bow, the empty map in her hand. "Was it worth it?" he asked softly. Isabel didn't answer immediately. She looked out over the endless sea, the horizon blurred by the golden haze of sunset. "The treasure wasn't the crown," she said at last. "It was the lesson." "And what lesson is that?" "That nothing worth having lasts forever." She turned to him, her eyes steady. "And that trust is the only thing that truly binds us." The Black Zephyr sailed on, its course unknown. The frost-etched map was gone, the crown a fleeting memory, but the scars of their journey remained. And though winter had faded, its shadow lingered in their hearts.